Hello, everyone. Today, we're diving into a shocking twist. Nye's disappearance lines up perfectly with the threatening text, and a traffic camera catches a car linked to Mr. Hawan. So what happens when the evidence points to Jame's own father, and protecting Diep and Nye could mean destroying filial piety forever? Stay with us, because the decision Jame makes next changes everything. The morning starts with a lie that tries to look like peace. Diep makes breakfast the way she always does. Small, careful movements, measured breaths. Nye sits at the table swinging her legs, humming like yesterday never happened. But Diep's eyes keep drifting to her phone. And Jame, standing at the sink, rinsing fruit, keeps watching Diep's reflection in the kitchen window. Not because he doubts her love, because he can feel the fear she's swallowing. When Nye runs off to pack her school bag, Jame lowers his voice. "Did you get any more messages?" Diep hesitates for half a second. That half second is all Jame needs. Diep answers softly, "No." Jame nods like he believes her, but his jaw tightens anyway. Because he doesn't. He doesn't call her a liar. He doesn't push. He just reaches for his own phone and says, "I'm going to check something." Diep watches him type, then pauses. "Jame," she says, "if this is about your father, please don't do anything reckless." Jame looks up. His expression is calm, but there's a new steadiness there now, something protective that didn't exist before. "I won't be reckless," he says. "I'll be clear." He walks Nye to school with Diep that day. No shortcuts, no familiar rhythm. He holds Nye's hand firmly and he keeps his eyes moving. Parked cars, passing scooters, the corners where people can linger. At the school gate, Diep forces a polite smile at the staff, but it looks brittle. Jame asks quietly to speak with the principal. Inside a small office, the principal repeats what they already heard. No cameras at the exact gate angle. No license plate record. No visible struggle. Nye left calmly. Jame's voice stays level. "So the policy is, if a child doesn't look scared, you let them go?" The principal shifts uncomfortably. "We believed it was an approved pickup." "Then we change that," Jame says. Effective today." He lays it out simply. No drama, no blame. Just new rules. Only Diep or Jame with a written confirmation. A daily code word, a mandatory call before release. The principal nods quickly, relieved someone is taking control. Diep watches Jame speak, and something in her face tightens. Gratitude, mixed with guilt. On the way home, she finally whispers, "You're acting like a real father." Jame doesn't look at her. His eyes stay forward. "I'm acting like what Nye deserves," he says. That afternoon, they sit in a small office that smells like paper and stale air conditioning. John's friend, a quiet tech guy, has agreed to help them look at anything public. Traffic cameras, timestamps, route logs, anything that can fill the missing hours. It feels surreal, like they're investigating a crime without being allowed to say the word crime. On the screen, a timeline appears. The school dismissal time, the time Diep called, the time the first anonymous message arrived. Jame leans forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked. Diep sits beside him, hands folded so tightly her fingers ache. The tech guy clicks through footage. Grainy, distant, ordinary. Cars passing, people moving. Nothing obvious. But even getting the footage wasn't easy. It took calls, favors, forms. "Some systems overwrite every few days," the tech guy had warned. "You're lucky you came fast." Lucky. Diep hates that word, because it means if they'd waited one more day, the truth would have vanished the way Nye did. Clean and temporary, like it never happened. Then, at one intersection near the school, the footage pauses. A vehicle appears briefly, just a few seconds, but Jame's posture changes instantly. He doesn't speak, His shoulders simply stiffen, like his body recognized something before his mind did. The tech guy zooms in on the rear angle. The license plate isn't fully readable, but the car's shape, the color, the minor scratches on the bumper. Diep whispers, "That's familiar." Jame's voice comes out low. "That's one of my father's cars." Diep's breath catches. "Are you sure?" Jame doesn't even blink. "I've seen it too many times." The room goes quiet. Even the computer fan sounds louder. Diep stares at the frozen frame like if she stares long enough it will become less real. It doesn't. The tech guy clears his throat. This doesn't prove he personally drove it, he says carefully. But it does show a link, a pattern. Jame nods once. A pattern is how you build a case. Diep turns her face toward Jame. Her eyes are wet, but she's trying to be steady. So, Nye being taken happened the same day the messages started. Jame's gaze stays on the screen. Not just the same day, he says. The same hours. He pulls out his phone and opens the message thread Diep had shown him. The unknown number, the cold lines, the casual cruelty. His thumb scrolls, slow and controlled. She's just out playing. If you don't listen, next time she'll play longer. Leave Jame, she will be safe, you stay. I don't promise anything. Jame stops scrolling. His voice drops, almost like he's talking to himself. He didn't just scare you. He measured your reaction. Diep's mouth goes dry. Like a test. Jame nods. And he's going to keep testing until he gets obedience. Diep's hands tremble. She presses her palms together under the desk, like prayer. Jame notices. He turns slightly toward her. Not soft, not angry, just present. Diep, he says. I need you to hear me clearly. Diep looks at him. Jame continues, voice steady. I won't let anyone use Nye against you again. Not my father. Not anyone. Diep's eyes flutter. How? Jame inhales, then says the words like a decision he's already made. I'm going to collect evidence, he says. Everything. Messages, times, footage, witness statements. And I'm going to sue him for unlawful detention. The tech guy shifts in his chair. Even he understands the weight of that sentence. Diep's face changes. Shock first, then fear so sharp it looks like pain. Jame, she whispers. That's your father. Jame nods. I know. He doesn't sound proud. He sounds tired. I grew up with a father who thought love meant control, Jame says quietly. I kept hoping one day he'd protect me the way a father should. His eyes harden slightly. He didn't. Diep's throat tightens. Jame leans forward again, voice lower, more personal. So, I'll act like the protective father he never was. For Nye. For you. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. That's why it hits so hard. Diep stares at him. She can see the truth. He isn't doing this for revenge. He's doing it because a line was crossed. Still, she can't breathe around the cost. After the trial, Diep begins, voice trembling. Will you still have a father? The question lands in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Jame's eyes flicker, just once. A small betrayal of emotion. He opens his mouth, then closes it. Because the honest answer hurts either way. Diep keeps going, quieter now. They'll say you're unfilial. They'll say you destroyed your own family. Jame swallows. People can say what they want. Nye is a child. Diep shakes her head, tears gathering. Then she says the thing she hates herself for thinking, but can't unthink. If it weren't for you, she says, voice cracking, I wouldn't have to choose between what's right and filial piety. Jame goes still. Not angry still, wounded still, like someone reached inside him and touched a bruise he didn't know was exposed. Diep wipes her cheek quickly, but more tears fall. "I don't mean you're the problem," she rushes. "I mean, your existence is what triggers this tragedy. He can't control you, so he punishes what you love. And then I'm the one holding the knife, choosing who gets hurt." James stares at the floor, jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumps near his temple. For a few seconds, he says nothing. Then he exhales. Slow, shaky. When he finally looks at Diep again, his eyes are darker, but not cruel. They're understanding, because he realizes what she's really saying. She isn't blaming him. She's confessing how trapped she feels. Jame nods once, accepting the weight. "You're not wrong about the cost," he says softly. Diep flinches. "But you're wrong if you think you carry it alone," Jame continues. He reaches into his bag and pulls out a thin folder. Screenshots, timestamps, a route map, printed notes. Then he pulls out a small flash drive. Diep's eyes widen. "You already started." Jame nods. Quietly, "And I'm backing it up twice." He taps the flash drive. "One stays with John, one stays with me. If anything disappears, we still have it." Diep whispers, "So you're really going to sue him?" Jame looks down at the folder. His grip tightens, then loosens, and his expression changes, subtle but clear. A shift from fire to strategy. "No," he says. Diep blinks, confused. "No?" Jame lifts his eyes. "Not now." Diep's face flickers between relief and panic. "Jame, if you don't..." "I'm not stopping," Jame says firmly. "I'm delaying." He slides the folder back into his bag like he's putting away a weapon, not discarding it. "I'll keep every piece of evidence," he says. "I'll build it clean. I'll prepare for the long game." Diep's breath shakes. "Why?" James' voice is quiet, but it carries iron. "Because I understand what you're afraid of. After the trial, I might win in court and lose you to guilt." He pauses. "So I won't sue him out of filial piety, and I won't spare him out of fear. I'm choosing a confrontation that lasts, one that protects Nye without burning everything down in one night." Diep looks at him, torn. "And what if your father realizes you didn't sue out of fear?" she whispers. What if he escalates because he thinks he still controls you?" James' eyes don't flinch. "Then he'll learn something new," James says quietly. "That I'm not obeying him." James stands. "Let's go pick up Nye," he says. Diep rises too, still trembling, and follows him out. As they step into the late afternoon light, Diep's phone buzzes. Unknown number. She freezes. Jame notices immediately. His hand hovers near her back, steady, protective. Diep looks down at the screen. One short message. "So, you chose to stay quiet." Diep's breath disappears. James' voice drops to a calm that scares even her. "Show me," he says. And as Diep tilts the phone toward him, the question hangs in the air like a storm forming. If Mr. Juan realizes he isn't being sued out of fear, will he back down or become even more dangerous?
Đúng giờ, khi Diệp gọi đến trường, họ nói có người đến đón, nhưng không có camera, không biển số, không dấu hiệu bất thường. Vài giờ sau, Diệp nhận tin nhắn từ số lạ. Con bé chỉ đi chơi thôi, nhưng nếu cô không nghe, lần sau nó sẽ đi chơi lâu hơn. Như được trả lại an toàn ở nơi công cộng, nhưng Diệp hiểu đây là màn thị uy. Mr. Hoàng chứng minh rằng ông có thể chạm vào điều cô yêu nhất bất kỳ lúc nào. Ngay sau đó, người ta bắt đầu nhìn Diệp khác đi vì tin đồn cô từng dính vào lừa đảo, khiến cô bị cô lập.